A very good evening and welcome to this post-budget analysis, the Stanbic Bank Budget Analysis 2019. My name is Charles Odongtho. Yes, I'm in a very unfamiliar territory, but why not? Why shouldn't I consume of the economic development, the growth, the progress that is going on? With me in the studio here at NBS Television, I have assembled a team of experts, regional, national, and let me start by introducing Mr. Samuel Mwogeza, Chief Financial Officer, Stanbic Bank Uganda. Samuel, you're most welcome to this.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, viewers, and thank you.
And good to see you. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Gibran Kureish, Regional Economist, Stanbic Bank East Africa. You're most welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You stay in Uganda or Kenya?
In Nairobi, in Kenya.
In Nairobi.
Yeah.
But you shuffle a lot between these places.
Always. Whenever there's potential in the markets, we have to be there.
Meaning each time I see you, there is a potential here.
Yeah.
Good. Miss Jacqueline Musitwa, she is a lawyer and development expert. You're most welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and good evening, viewers.
Dr. Adam Mugume, he is no stranger to this studio. He has been here before, Executive Director for Research, Bank of Uganda. The guys who are in the news, but for different reasons that we shall not discuss today.
Thank you.
You agree?
Thank you, and I agree.
It's good to have you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Birungi Korutaro, she is Country Manager for Kilimo Trust. You're most welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, viewers.
Good, and we welcome you out there to partake of this discussion. We are going to be looking at the focus areas, one of them being creating the right jobs for shared and sustainable economic growth, as well as looking at the current budget priorities, whether they can, affect or address the economic transformation agenda that the budget is looking at. Let me start with Kureish. Is this budget, the 2019-20 budget, 40.4 trillion, how different is it from last year's? Or is it different at all?
Well, when you read the document, there's a lot of similarities. The theme is still around industrialization, so there's a bit of a relentless desire by the government to grow agribusiness or agro-processing, manufacturing. But I think, I've never seen a budget document when I read one in East Africa, and I've thought to myself, no, this is not inspiring. On paper, it's always an inspiring document, and the 2019-2020 budget for Uganda as well had all the right points on paper, but implementation is always key. This is a very large budget. In economic terms, we call it an expansionary fiscal policy. The deficit that the government is planning to run this year is over 8% of GDP, which is a pretty big budget, and of course it brings about a lot of questions of how it's going to be funded. There'll be a lot more borrowing locally, potentially even externally. But of course, expenditure is great, but so long as you spend on some of the right infrastructure projects, which I believe we're going to be discussing as the show goes on.
Sure. And looking at Dr. Adam, you are the guy who looks at the figures, the figure crunching and all that at the Bank of Uganda. Are the figures right? Can the figures that are presented to us the right ones that we can talk about?
The figures are right. The only challenge I have is misuse of the figures.
Who misuses them?
Everybody. I have seen most of the people misusing numbers in the set. I remember it is like you have planned to have, say, development expenditure. Out of the 40 trillion, probably you have around 16 trillion or 10 trillion. But at the end of the day, the money that you put in as development doesn't go there. It is either the projects are not implemented or they lag behind, and the recurrent is much higher. So, and the problem we have is that we don't follow over the years. That's why I'm saying misusing the figures, because if you look at, say, the last 5 years, have we budgeted for development expenditure and development expenditure happened the same way? Or have we budgeted for recurrent, and actually recurrent became much higher than what was budgeted for? So that's why I'm saying that sometimes we misuse the figures, and we have no recall that actually to track behind the numbers and say, okay, consistently, this is the issue.
Why don't we have that recall? Why can't we recall?
That's why I'm saying
that the people, the experts like Adam, or even your colleagues, I'm using Adam to mean you and your colleagues, why don't you recall that last year we had this assigned to this development, but it wasn't done, and these are the reasons. Wouldn't that be the best idea?
No, ideally, you are putting me on the task to go on the fiscal side. But ideally, it should not be Adam or the technocrats. It should be everybody, every Ugandan, because this is our budget. So if you leave it to Adam, Adam will mislead you. But it's up to everybody, because we all are listen to the budget. We all have the records of the budgets. So it is up to every Ugandan to follow up and say, okay, but last year you told us this. What happened? And I think that's why I'm saying that probably we tend to misuse the numbers, or we don't follow up on the numbers.
Jacqueline, you need to help us there. As a development expert, do you think that kind of argument by Adam makes them run away from the issue? Because you cannot say everybody. It has to be some experts, probably people responsible, to look and recall the figures so that we can then realign. If there was a mistake, we bring it back into line, isn't it?
I actually
How can we do it better?
I tend to agree with Adam on this one, because ultimately, as a taxpayer, as a citizen, it is my responsibility to understand where my money is going and how government is using that appropriately, and also what my role is as a citizen as far as either creating a business and employing people, or as far as paying taxes. So I think those accountability mechanisms aren't as strong as they should be. A lot of that conversation you find sometimes coming up on social media. You know, the media is trying to hold government accountable, but ultimately I do think that the more education there is about the budget, the more people understand what's in it, and the more people can track it over time, I think there will be increasing conversations on how do you hold government more accountable. One. Two, I also think there's an element that as we see population growth continue to rise, as you see the rise in unemployment figures, I think we'll come to a point where government is forced to answer these questions more directly to citizens who are saying, I've done what I'm supposed to do. How do you help me navigate this document and understand ultimately how it will help me, my family, and my community? So once again, I think the first step, education, but two, all of us have a responsibility to really hold government accountable, but also all of us do have individual responsibilities to contribute to make sure that this budget, as well as the development plans in place, lead us to where we want to be.
Maybe before I bring in Samuel, there is a feeling that there is a growing income inequality, and we talk about the national, I think the national household survey done by government last year and the year before all revealed that I think especially north and east, poverty is increasing, and yet we have a budget which we are saying, the colleagues of Dr. Adam, not exactly from Bank of Uganda, but probably from Ministry of Finance and the team, are saying that there is growth in the economy. What are those disparities for? Why the contradiction?
And I think this is something that I think is worthy of this conversation tonight. How do we make sure that the numbers that we're reporting as far as GDP growth actually impact the people on the ground, and there is the trickle-down effect? It's not enough to say we're moving towards a middle-income country without people being able to serve their kids 3 meals a day, without being able to take them to a healthcare facility that has the necessary medications, or to educate them with the skills that they will need for tomorrow. Now, that growing disparity is not only one that's in Uganda, but that's an overall development challenge across the globe, and it is one that I think we do need to think a little bit harder about how we're going to bridge that income inequality gap. Our failure to do that, I think, really is a disservice, not only in years to come, but ultimately, I think we will start to see stresses in this so-called growth, because it's ultimately not going to be sustainable.
When you talk about sustaining development. You are talking about bridging the inequality and all that. Samuel, I want to bring you in at this point. You are the guy who is supposed to distribute for us to us the money, borrowing, and the youth are a big chunk of this population called Uganda, and the biggest complaint they always have is cost of credit, and it's so high to borrow if they want to start businesses. Government is shouting, you have to become entrepreneurs once you have left school. Why is it still high? Is it something you can explain for us?
I think, Charles, that's a very relevant and pertinent question, because I think we'll all agree that access to finance and affordable finance are critical aspects for development. And also in terms of empowering the youth, these are key, it's a key engine or a key fuel for that growth. But I think before I start to answer the question about access to finance, I just want to give some context around the realities of the true bottlenecks that we face that really impede that growth. Because we've given money to youth before, and I think it's not the first time. I know in the budget that was read, we've also seen additional funding being given to the youth. I think it's about 140 or 130 billion, in addition to some additional funds for capacity enhancement. And what we've seen is that if I speak about the cost of credit, because the cost of credit has for a long time been said to be one of the reasons that causes businesses to struggle. And I think 2 years ago we did a very detailed study at Stanbic, where we were assessing very high NPLs and asking the question to say, what is driving these NPLs up? And we found that as opposed to cost of credit, we found that specifically there were 2 or 3 other factors. One was disrupted market. So suppliers or traders who had been trading with South Sudan, got some challenges when the border closed, when the political tensions rose as they did, and that closed that market. We also saw the issue of government areas that caused a disruption to the ability for people to supply because they weren't getting paid on time. And the last one that we saw that was very interesting was diversion of funds. So people borrow for one thing and they do another thing. Mm-hmm. So what came out for us very clearly is that access to funds and cost of funding are not the primary engine. Now, it's not a primary bottleneck. It's something that we need to unlock and get an answer for. But we established that there were 2 other things that were more important. And one of them linked to access to real information. So people ask the question, what should I do to create real economic outcome as a youth in this country? What are the opportunities available for me? And hopefully these are some of the answers that we'll provide here. What are the opportunities available? And the other question that was very closely linked to that is, in addition to understanding the opportunities, how do I prepare for these opportunities? What do I need to do differently to make myself able to be a part of the table when these opportunities are being shared? And it came out for us very clearly that in looking at that, that access to a marketable idea that the youth can apply themselves to, that links them to an active market. So I produce something and there's a clear linkage to the market. It's something that was missing. And the other one that was also missing was the discipline and the understanding of sound business principles. How do I actually run a business sustainably? And if we simply advance access to funds without addressing the first 2, we will not have a sustainable outcome.
So which one should be the one ahead?
So access to funds...
Which one should be the egg and which one should be the chicken?
It's an interesting question. But access to funds should typically come at the end. So have clarity about the market principles, have clarity about the opportunity, be clear about what it means to run a sound business.
So skills.
Skills. And there is some mention in the budget that we have on capacity development among the youth. And it's going to be important to see how this money is actually put to work so that it achieves the outcome that is intended. But once you address those 2, access to finances is a very easy outcome at the end of the equation. So hopefully we debunk that myth as part of this conversation.
Jacqueline, is that a question that you can easily answer? how can we do it right, the skilling of the young people? Because I'm more worried about the young people, the women, because I think they form the bulk or the biggest share of the group that we should be concerned about in order to spur economic development. How should it be done?
I do applaud this budget for putting a lot in skills development. Having said that, I do think that there needs to be education reform at the primary, secondary level as well. You can't expect tertiary as well as advanced vocational training to fix problems that started from the foundation of people's education. So I do think we need to sit down and look, where is the education sector going? How can we best equip people with the skills for tomorrow? It's not a simple matter of saying, let's focus on technology, science, technology, education, and focus that way. I think holistically, we need to look at the quality of education that children are receiving. And then moving forward, we need to look at the skills gaps that exist. We're saying focus on industrialization, which is fine, but what skills do people need to make sure that we actually properly industrialize them? If we're saying that it's training to make sure that someone can move one gadget from one person to another, that's one thing. But ultimately, if we are going to be competitive and moving forward into the fourth industrial revolution, we need to start thinking critically about skills of tomorrow and making sure that we start to really cover those today. And that futuristic thinking, I'm not seeing as much, but that is a challenge that I think countries all over the world are dealing with. So skills, yes, but I do think we need to think more critically about the skills that will be necessary for a successful, prosperous future. Okay,
let me bring in Dr. Birungi at this point. Samuel talked about the opportunities, and I borrow a lot from the national survey by UBOS that beyond 70% of the population is agro-based. And people might wonder, I've finished my graduate study and then you want me to go into agriculture. Is it a worthwhile, area to run into immediately after leaving a university with a degree in law, a university degree in mass communication, in whatever it is?
True. I mean, agriculture is just like any other sector and should be seen as a business opportunity. So we should be talking about agribusiness. And the opportunities for the youth are there. I mean, when you look at the youth, our country has 78% of the population is below 30. Of that, 22%, which is about 7.7 million, is between the ages of 18 to 30. So we would expect these to be actively either in school or actively employed somewhere. However, 58% of these are in rural areas, and the opportunities for being involved in agriculture are there. Agriculture is not just about planting or digging. It's not just about production. There are opportunities along the entire value chain. So there are those activities on farm, for instance, providing spraying services. The youth can be involved in commercial enterprises like spraying services. They can also become traders and become agents, buying agents. We have seen those that are involved in the coffee value chain that are making huge commissions in the millions out of buying coffee and streamlining the supply chains for the coffee buyers. There are also opportunities on farm management services. We find that there are the population that is involved in agriculture is aging. There are opportunities for farm management services. You do the project management right from handling the workers, the planting, right to the selling of goods and services. So the provision of services is huge, and the youth should be able to embrace these opportunities. Being traders, opportunities are also endless in multiple value chains, especially those that we see that the country wants to drive and support the agro-industrialization.
Which brings me to a follow-up question on agriculture. Are you pleased with the budget on agriculture? 1,057 billion shillings, something about there. Are you pleased with it? Can it address it? Many people celebrated that it finally crossed the 1 trillion mark. but it's still way below. You remember is it the Abuja agreement,
yes,
the protocol on agriculture by the states, that it should at least be 10% for agro-based countries like Uganda.
Yes.
But it's still way below, not even 3% I think right now. Are you pleased with that?
We see an increase of about 13%. It's still 3% of the total budget. It's small, but I'm happy with that for a start because of the focus that has been put on this budget. We see that there's been a lot of emphasis on improving on-farm and off-farm irrigation services, so our farmers that are dependent heavily on rain-fed agriculture can access irrigation, and that will be good to support productivity. We also see that there is a lot in terms of fisheries. The government has put in their funds for fisheries, improving animal breeds, and the crop varieties into research. So yes, the budget is good for agriculture. The challenge is, of course, always, like has already been mentioned, is implementation. We are not able to absorb it fully, and even in the previous budget, we are not able to absorb the money that was allocated to us. That said, there are still other opportunities that this budget presents. For instance, import duty on 15 of the agricultural products. That supports agro-processing. Our local industries have been supported. Agro-machinery has been exempt of VAT. So our sprayers, our weeders, the youth that they can use for the commercial services right in the rural communities can be much more affordable since they have been exempt. We also see that they have removed withholding tax on payment of agricultural supplies. So that means our traders that are supporting, for instance, supplying the army and other large institutions can now get, they are exempt from withholding tax. So the opportunities are there, and it is a good budget.
Okay, to you out there viewing this program and listening in to this is the Stanbic Bank Budget Analysis 2019. We're going to take a short break in order to rest a bit and feel the money and feel the budget. The gentlemen and ladies here are all guys who deal with the cash. So let's rest a bit and I enjoy that. Let's take that break. Welcome back from the break, and this is the Stanbic Bank Budget Analysis, and with me in the studio I have the Chief Finance Officer, the CEO of Stanbic Bank Uganda, Mr. Samuel Mogeza. I also have Gibran Quresh, he's a regional economist, Stanbic Bank East Africa. We have Ms. Jacqueline Musitwa, a lawyer and development expert. We have Dr. Adam Mugume, he's an executive director in charge of research, Bank of Uganda, and Dr. Birungi Korotaro, country manager, Kilimo Trust. And we are looking at the opportunities that the current budget, the 2019, just read last week, presents. And what are the opportunities? What are the bottlenecks? Can we address them? The experts are here, and that's what we are looking at. Gibran, this budget has been heavy on focusing on industrialization. And the question that begs is, where do we industrialize? And what is the link between industrialization and job creation to address the bottleneck of unemployment?
Sure. So I think if you look at the demographics of Uganda, as has already been alluded to, a very youthful population. Some stats show that nearly 50% of the population is below the age of 15 and growing at 3.5% annually. In many other parts of the world, that would be seen as a demographic dividend, but in this part of the world, if you're not creating jobs fast enough, it's a bit of a demographic curse. So I think when you talk about industrialization, you're talking about, again, value chain, so not just manufacturing alone, so you're talking about agro-processing, the whole value chain. So if you look at the case studies from the Asian tigers, from other Southeast Asian markets, they had similar demographics, they had similar challenges back in the 80s and the 90s, and of course, they absorbed a lot of semi-skilled labor through the manufacturing sector. So I think, obviously, you need to see some reforms, whether it's in the budget or whether it's actually implemented, to actually have manufacturing become a dominant driver of growth. Because currently, again, what was mentioned earlier, why don't we feel GDP? You know, if your economy is predominantly being driven by a thriving services sector, and you've got a large base of your employed people within agriculture, manufacturing, which is subsistence or which is informal, and hence not productive, then of course you're not going to actually feel that growth. So I think it's a step that is important. It's a step that needs to be taken, industrialization, to formalize a lot of jobs. And of course, if we start seeing jobs in the correct sectors, then you'll start to feel inclusivity of that GDP growth.
Speaking of the industries, there has been a lot of reference to the industrial parks, Namamve and regional industrial parks. Do you think that is the right focus for us as a country to peg on?
I don't think it hurts. I mean, if you look at a lot of these special economic zones across the East African community, there have been some success stories, but there have also been some horror stories. But I think it also is obviously a prerequisite to at least, embolden or encourage, foreign investors to come in. At least it's a stepping stone. But, if you set up, the industrial parks, as we've seen, a lot of emphasis was put on in the budget. But if you don't have reliable power, if you don't address, tariffs at the borders, if you have labor productivity issues, if you have general concerns about productivity overall and efficiency, then of course it's you've done one thing but you've not done 10 things. So I think yes, great, you should have industrial parks, but you should look at the holistic picture needed to fully industrialize and again absorb the youthful labor. So look at everything holistically.
And when you're talking industrial parks, you're talking production of or increase in job opportunities, you're talking youth, then you're talking skills. And then you're also talking local content in terms of the, how can you relate the opportunities for these industrial parks to the need to have a lot of local content realized?
So of course, a lot of other panelists here who are more specialized in the skills debate than I am, but when you look at local content, it's definitely a growing debate across East Africa, because again, there's been a concern that we may have very impressive GDP numbers, but because the foreign firms who are building, for example, the infrastructure are not procuring cement or iron ore locally or steel locally, we're not seeing that commensurate, benefit in terms of tax revenue for the government or even for locally, people in terms of jobs. But again, it goes back to capacity. Yes, local content is important, especially as Uganda transitions towards a more, hydrocarbon economy with the oil that we're expecting to see in the next couple of years. With that, especially local content rules need to be watertight to be able, for Ugandans to see that benefit. But again, and I'm sure my panelists will touch upon this, the skills debate comes in. If you want to develop, the oil gas fields and you don't have enough capacity locally, there's no point saying that we're not going to do it if we don't get it locally. At some point in time,
it must be done.
Exactly. You have to address the issue of where you can address the skills gap to be able to ensure that in the future that's not a problem.
Okay. Then I should bring in Samuel to tie that loose knot. The question of skills, you at Stanbic Bank, you have this the regional incubator, which many people have praised as a good innovation. How useful is that in addressing the kind of gap in skills for the young people that that Qureshi is talking about?
So, Charles, I think these interventions are absolutely critical. And if I speak specifically around what Stanbic has done with the incubator, and maybe before talking about the incubator, Gibran makes a very good point to say that a lot of investment is going towards infrastructure and funded by debt. And that in of itself is not a problem, because we do need this infrastructure, we need this enabling infrastructure in place. But the challenge, of course, is that even though the payback period of infrastructure takes a long time, you also have the double effect of a lot of these contracts being won by, you don't have a lot of local participation, participation. So we saw that specifically in the significant project that happened over the recent years, and less than 7% on some of these projects, which means in addition to having a low payback period on the infrastructure, you have then missed the multiplier effect. So what we did specifically as Stanbic was to develop the incubator primarily initially to support oil and gas, and to say, if we look at the sector that we expect to be transformational over the next few years, oil and gas is a key one. And we've seen the learnings where local content participation has been low historically. So we basically put together a program in partnership with key partners, from government, with private sector, and put together a program that was meant to bring real practical training skills. And again, to your earlier question, you asked me about access to finance. And again, when we did the review of what was necessary to unlock, it was clear that access to markets and access to sound business practices were the key things that we needed to address. So the incubator looks to unlock the sound business practices and is a very well put together framework that brings in partners who bring real practical skill sets to the participants. We've trained over 500 participants initially. And
this is within a period of how long? Within
a year. And okay. We were intentional about doing initially a small rollout so that we could learn from it. And we've taken a lot of learnings that have allowed us to then see how do we scale it. So over the next year, we do intend to scale this to the different regions. And the important point is that you don't have to be a Stanbic customer. We're not locking this to Stanbic customers. We're saying any enterprise that is looking to be part of the oil and gas economy, we are going to enable and facilitate access to training to the extent that we are able to practically. So we've planned for some regional rollouts, and we're planning to train literally the thousands of SMEs over the next few years. And if we can have more interventions of this sort, driven either by private or really facilitated and enabled by government, I think these are the sort of initiatives that unlock the skills problem that we have within the country.
Okay. Dr. Adam, there is the question that Gibran touched on, the issue of the GDP, some people feeling that they don't feel the GDP, and that there is growth that is talked about, reported to us every around this period, but then they don't feel it in the pocket. Why is that so? Why does that happen? Or are the local ordinary persons lying?
I think we started by, I don't know who, one of the panelists who said the majority of people in the rural areas in agriculture. The question is, if they're in agriculture, then what is out of the 6.1% growth in this financial year, how much did agriculture grow? You find that it's in the range of 3%, for example, food crop. Then you say the population in the rural area grows much faster than even the urban area at 3.something%. Ideally, if agriculture is growing at 3%, and then the rural population is growing much faster than agriculture, then the impact is that actually the welfare of those in agriculture will be lesser compared to before in terms of per capita. And that's what we see. So if you look at the numbers critically, you see that the biggest growth is in service driven by trade. Traders, that's the biggest. And the other sector that is growing very fast is, say, ICT and banking and insurance. So those are the sectors you see that are growing fast. Manufacturing, growing in the range of 3% in the last 5 years, with a share of 7.5% of GDP. You see that it is challenged. And I think that's why I believe I support the budget in the sense that, yes, with industrialization drive, probably manufacturing sector will pick up to grow much faster, and also the share in GDP would be much higher. And it goes back into employment cycle, etc. So I think that the focus of industrialization is really very crucial. However, I don't believe that industrialization driven by import substitution is the way. My argument would be do industrialization, but focus on exporting. Because naturally we all know exporting firms that are doing manufacturing are more efficient, employ more people, pay better, and therefore they are that's the best drive. And so the link with the industrialization, manufacturing, doing with a drive towards exporting is the best way. For example, we were celebrating about the Soroti fruit factory. Imagine if that fruit factory was using local farmers to produce the fruits, you process them into juice, and then exporting them. That is where the multiplication would be much stronger than saying, okay, let me produce the juice and remove the one that is imported from the supermarkets. So that would not be the best way to do industrialization and therefore to spark growth.
But some of the sectors you talked about, the fastest growing, ICT, banking, insurance, these are mostly urban-based, which begs the question then, when you gather probably your research reports, you're gathering from all over the country, and yet they are coming from some of them are coming from those regions that don't feel these sectors at all. Which begs the question, therefore, should we start collecting the GDP reports based on regions? Should we regionalize them?
No, well, I mean, whether you
would that be good for the...
Well, it is good, but even if you do it, do we know that very well that economic activity around Kampala, Mukono, Wakiso, 80% of the activity is basically around. Whether you talk about banking, insurance, we're talking about even manufacturing, by the way. That's where I agree that the drive towards the zonal parks probably would help. But basically, if you look at activity, including consumer expenditure, whether you want to look at GDP by expenditure, whether you look at activity basically is around here. Yeah. So ideally, collecting GDP by region, whether you do it by region, still you are going to come back to say, okay, activity is around Kampala. So,
okay, which brings me to another animal in the room when we talk about money and we talk about the economy. Jacqueline, the question of debt is the way we are moving currently. Is our debt sustainable as we are now? And should we borrow domestically and run a risk of crowding out the local traders? Is that the best way to do it for a good economy, ideally?
I think Gibran is better placed to answer that. But having said that, though, I do think it is important for us to build the necessary infrastructure, right, within means that we understand over time how that money is going to be paid back. I think it's that disconnect sometimes of us seeing that we're investing in infrastructure now that will that we have to repay in 10, 20 years. And the question is, will that infrastructure still be able to supply the growth in the economy that we need in the short to medium term? And so I think that disconnect is something we need to deal with. But when we look across Africa right now, debt figures continue to rise, and it's starting to be a concerning story globally around kind of the development in Africa and whether there is currently debt sustainability. So I think that is something to kind of keep on the radar.
Yeah, because even when you look at our 40 trillion budget, isn't it 10 trillion? The highest item to, number one, to start paying or to focus is debt. So it becomes a big issue. But we are going to take a second break, a very short one at this point. And when we come back, Gibran, the question of debt, I want you to touch on it and share with us how Kenya is doing, because we hear certain stories. But that will come after this break. Let's go for that break. Welcome back to this last segment of this Stanbic Bank Budget Analysis 2019. With me in the studio, and we're right into our last segment, with me in the studio, the Chief Finance Officer, Stanbic Bank Uganda, Mr. Samuel Mogeza. We have Gibran Quresh, he's a regional economist for Stanbic Bank East Africa. We have Miss Jacqueline Musitwa, she is a lawyer and development expert. We have Dr. Adam Mugume, who is Executive Director for Research, Bank of Uganda, and Dr. Birungi Korutaro, who is the Country Manager for Kilimo Trust. Now, before we went into the break, there was the question that I threw at Musitwa, and she requested that you supplement on the issue of debt sustainability. The way we are as Uganda currently, and you can even give the example of Kenya. Are we on the right track, or are we sliding on the other side of it, which is dangerous?
I think I agree with broadly what Jacqueline mentioned around the key importance of taking up debt to spend on productive assets that will as Sam said, have a multiplier impact on the economy. If you look at Uganda, debt to GDP currently at 41%. I'm not a big fan of that metric. I like to look at debt service as a percentage of tax or as a percentage of exports. So again, I don't really mind if the government's taking up debt so long as I see a corresponding rise in exports or even in tax receipts, which then would broadly suggest to me that there's money being put to the right use. In Kenya, for example, we've got our debt to GDP at about 56%. But of course, what
is the acceptable?
So it's very difficult because look, Japan's got a debt to GDP of 100%, but that doesn't mean that Kenya and Uganda should have a debt to GDP of 100%. Japan borrows at 0%. So there's a big difference. A lot of people compare our debt to GDP ratios to advanced economies, which I don't think is correct. But again, spending on the right projects, it's been said by the panelists as well. The Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya is a good example of a project that perhaps may not result in the multiplier effects that we all initially hoped it will. And of course, we're now seeing that Uganda is opting not to contract debt or to build their SGR. They want to rehabilitate the old meter gauge railway. So I think these kind of things, priorities are going to matter. But one thing, when you look at debt, you need to remember that there was a HIPIC debt relief.
Yes.
Dr. Mugume in 2006.
We had about 4 trillion?
Yeah. So, Kenya at that time was classified as a slightly more developed country, so they never got that benefit, back in 2006. So Uganda had that benefit. But again, you've got a very weak domestic savings, level or rate in this economy, and East Africa is no different. So when you have such ambitious infrastructure plans to industrialize, which mainly means infrastructure spending inevitably, you're not going to get that money from the domestic market. You're going to get the money from the external market. And when you look at the global environment, the U.S. Federal Reserve, the central bank in the U.S. is now potentially going to cut rates. And there's a lot of cheap money out there. So I know a lot of people are concerned about going to the external markets to borrow, especially if you can't find room to absorb it. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, or it's not necessarily expensive.
But the question is, where should we borrow from, ostensibly? Should we borrow from here and risk, crowding out the local traders, commercial traders who want to borrow, and the government now competing with the local guy on the market? So
that goes to the question you asked, Sam. Why is the cost of credit high? One of the deficiencies is because the government's one of the biggest borrowers from commercial banks. But again, if you look at this budget, one positive for us, at least as financial market participants, was the withholding tax on the 10 and 15-year government bonds was reduced from 20% to 10%, which is a big plus. Because if you want to borrow locally and you don't want to go to the external market, then you might as well borrow on the longer end of the bond curve, as we call it. So you might as well lengthen the duration of your liabilities, because the refinancing risk stays smaller than borrowing on the 3-month, on the 6-month treasury bill. So I'd say, you should find the right mix. You don't over borrow locally, and of course you don't over borrow externally, because Again, if you overborrow externally and you don't export enough or bring in enough FDI, foreign direct investment, then you will run into problems.
Okay. Doctor, there is a question that someone would want to know. This budget, generally speaking, would you term it as a normal, good budget, or would someone be right to say it is an election budget?
It could be both, but I would insist that it's still a good budget that is driving our agro-industrialization. I think the emphasis has been put in the right areas, but I think there's a lot more that can be done to streamline the effectiveness of government in terms of implementation. We see there is building the capacity of youth, but also there is more information specifically on what exactly our industrialization strategy or pathway is. If we are looking at export markets, what are we telling our farmers, our processors there about those export markets? Who are we exporting to? What volumes are we looking at? So that people are not just speculative investors in the agricultural sector, because our farmers are the largest private sector in this country, the agricultural sector, but they just don't know exactly what to do. So the information on markets and also on data. Data is critical in terms of determining how best we can ensure that public investment is done in the right places. Data from the private sector, from the processors, the farmers, the traders, but also in government itself, so that implementation is done much better and from a much more informed position.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sam, I just we are now coming to the end of the show. Your take as a CEO running the biggest, you're running the biggest bank in Uganda by all standards in terms of asset base and all that, liquidity. In just 30 seconds, wind the program down. What do you see going forward?
I think, Charles, first of all, I'll thank you for promoting me. I'm not the CEO of the bank. I am the Chief Financial Officer.
Oh, yeah.
But I'll be sure to let Patrick know that you wish the best for me.
I wish you luck.
But I think we're in a place where we need to have serious solutions. And I think we're in a situation where we cannot be focused too much on what our quote-unquote politicking of the budget, but to say what are the meaningful steps we can take. And we've talked about a couple of things here. Industrialization is powerful and useful, but we need to unlock how we make agriculture a real driver for this economy. It still employs about 70% of the people in the country. How do we address the market linkages, the skills gap, and then foster more collaboration and partnership that is intentional about finding real solutions to the problems we have.
Thank you so much. We are now going into the news, and I want to thank Samuel Mogeza, Chief Financial Officer, Stanbic Bank Uganda, Mr. Gibran Quresh, Regional Economist, Stanbic Bank East Africa, Ms. Jacqueline Musitwa, Lawyer and Development Expert, Dr. Adam Mugume. Next time we shall be discussing with him issues of Bank of Uganda. He is the Research Officer with the Research Director, and Dr. Birungi Korutaro, who is the Country Manager, Kilimo Trust. Now is the next coming on NBS is live at 9 with, guess who? Samson Kasumba.